Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you're all doing well. I am doing quite well, other than the fact that my eating habits have been destroyed. And I'm not sure about you, but I think sometimes this kind of thing that they put on sale is just too much. I've been eating those till I go into a coma. This can rarely lasts a day. It's awful. Anyway, I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're um, feeling as if God is with you in this every day. Kind of, a lot of you are not in your regular routines. Some of you are, but a lot of you are finding disruption. Even if you're working at home, it's a different environment. And so I'm kind of hoping that whatever you are doing and however this impacts you, that you still have a sense of God's movement in your life and some joy and peace. Um, because sometimes it's more difficult when you're out of your routine um, to do that. I just want to remind you of the need to be, as an act of worship, supporting the church. I know that we don't have an offering plate to go around. Some of you aren't connected to online banking, and I suspect that those of you who aren't probably aren't watching this anyway. But if you do have a check that you'd like to give, um, the person who collects that would be Dave Sager. And if you were to bring something by for him, put it in his mailbox and give him a ring so that he can deposit that, that would be great. Otherwise, we have the e-transfer. And if you need help with that, just phone, and it's quite a simple thing, but I can talk you through it. So it's interesting to me that this period of self isolation lands during Lent. And Lent is the 40 days coming up to Easter or Good Friday. And it's 40 days for a number of reasons. That's one of those numbers that is significant in Scripture. Uh, we see that Jesus fasts for 40 days, and in a way of focusing him, testing him, that kind of thing. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days. Presumably, he was fasting, he was with God directly. It's not just a time of food fasting. Uh, people give up certain things that they enjoy for Lent. Um, and that is the whole point, is to develop some self-discipline and to stay away from the things that might encumber us and have too much of a hold on us. So for me, uh, food fasting, because I I do dearly love food. Um, it has been significant when I have given it up, and there's a couple of times when I've done a week of fasting, and those were healthy times and times when I was focused, but also just the discipline of doing it. So now it's a time uh, of isolation for us. That Lent is meant as a preparation time to prepare the heart for Easter and Good Friday and the significance of that. And we are going to try our best to run a service next week as Good Friday and possibly Easter, but we're going to have to do it over the internet, which means some people uh, fall between the cracks there. But we're kind of hoping that everybody can join us on Zoom, and there'll be instructions going out as to how best to do that. But Lent is a time for doing without. Um, People give up video games or TV or the internet or Facebook or things, and it requires self-discipline to do that. And now we are having to discipline our lives in a very particular and some would say drastic way. And all around the world, this is happening. Um, so, in a way, fasting, doing the Lent thing, doing without meat or TV or snacks, that's difficult. But giving up the meeting of family and friends and hanging out at Subway and having coffee or at the Fast Gas and having coffee is really far more disruptive. God made us into social beings. Very deep in our makeup is this need for each other, and we're created that way. It's not a weakness. It is the way we were created. So food might be a weakness, and you stay away from it. But eating is not a weakness. We all do it. So we have built in this need for each other, for anybody. And so we have families, we have friends, we have school, we have work, we have these circles of people in our lives that meet that need. And one of the big ones for me anyway is the church, you people. And we're made that way. Most of you have spouses and family, and that's great. But even within that context, there still can be a lot of loneliness and the need for others. What happens when we aren't allowed to be with people, when we're shut off and isolated? I think of the movie Castaway. It's a story of how somebody working for UPS or some delivery company is lost at sea on an airplane and gets stranded on an island for years by himself. And Tom Hanks, who plays that character, goes a little crazy because there's nobody to interact with. There's nothing. It's an unnatural situation for people to be alone like that. He makes friends with his volleyball, which he calls Wilson, and he talks to it and talks to it as if it's a person. It speaks back to him. It's a little odd. But people go crazy when they're on their own. Some of you may already be starting to talk to yourselves or making invisible friends. Fasting is not a bad thing, but it only lasts for a time. It's a willingness to do without. It's a matter of self-discipline to do without. But it only lasts for a specific period of time. What we desperately need is food. We can't live without food. We die without food. Doing without food means we maybe appreciate it more. We may get a handle on our eating habits when we stop for a while. And with myself, kind of undisciplined in some respects, I think fasting is something that is good, and I should probably do it more often. But there's a difference between fasting and being in a famine. A famine is something that you have no choice to be in. The circumstances dictate that you go on a fast. It's not a willingness, it's not an act of discipline. It's an act of dealing with the situation. And some of us get by better without people than others. Some of us, like myself, are socially driven, and some of you do fine on your own for long periods of time. But that's kind of a rare thing, and somehow, even those people who are not very social still need people. There might be a small number of people, but they still need people. And we starve spiritually and mentally when we don't have that, simply because we're just not made to do without people. That's the way we're made. We're made to be social animals. God's solution to that is to put people into community. Community always takes effort. Community always is something that requires something from us. And that's the way it is with any relationship. Whether you're married or just at work or school or doing whatever you're doing, it takes work. It takes effort. You have to put you have to invest in people. But God has given us these communities, whether we believe in Him or not, because we're created that way. He's given us these communities in which to enjoy each other and live together. Now, I'm talking about this because right now, when we're not able to meet together, it's a topic of interest to me, because how do we remain a community? How do we remain a church when we don't have our services and our Bible studies and so on? How do we do that? And of course, I'm thinking a lot about that all the time, and I'm talking to other pastors and people all the time to find out how they're doing things. It's interesting that when God sets up the community, the Israelite community, He sets up a structure with which it functions, and the laws that community functions with, and also the worship. The instructions for worship are social instructions. God doesn't leave it up to the Israelites to figure it out on their own. He sets up the when and the where and the how in the Old Testament. If you look through the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, it's just full of explanations about community and how to be a community. Now, back at the temple worship, it was costly. It interfered with your life to worship God, and yet it was still expected. The head of the household had to walk to Jerusalem to join in the festivals, and it wasn't really optional. People maybe didn't do it, but they weren't devout. Jesus went every every year to the festivals with his family. You can imagine how much disruption that would be. But you had to go to the temple. You had to be with, you couldn't go to the temple when there was nobody there. You went for the festival when everybody was there. You had to do certain things. You had to make sacrifices. You had to sing songs and say prayers and so on. It was regimented to some extent. And you had to bring gifts. It was costly even in that aspect of it. You brought money, you brought your sacrifices, you brought your tithe. And it wasn't just the Israelites that were demanded to come. It was somebody from every household had to be there. That was the law. So in Deuteronomy 16, verses 16 and 17, it says this: 3 times a year all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, at the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of tabernacles. No one should appear before the Lord empty-handed. Each of you must bring a gift in proportion to the way the Lord your God has blessed you. You can see that there's an expectation here. People were very happy to come together. It wasn't supposed to be an onerous duty. There are times in the history of Israel when Israel was asked to give towards something. And every time the giving was so much that they had to stop donating. And they gave with joy. They gave because they were a community and they wanted to support the community. And there's something about that is, I think, really important in that it's the motivation. So there are instructions on every aspect of worship. The festivals were full of pomp and pageantry and imagery and colors and sounds and music and worship. It was just full of that for days and days. The Festival of Tabernacles, we've discussed this before, was like a big camp out. People would make these shelters and they'd stay in them, and you could imagine the kids roaring around and making friends and being around people that they haven't seen for a year, and cousins and nephews. And I mean, you can imagine the closeness that developed. The New Testament also has instructions about worship. The early church met together and ate together. They called it a love feast. And that was expected. That's just what you did to maintain the relationships. They had communion together. They communed together. It was a representation of the banquet, the wedding feast of the Lamb. And so they were participating in something that was exclusive to them, to people who were saved, people who were walking with the Lord. There was instructions for proper worship and singing and prophecy and all these things. There's instructions for that Paul and Peter give. But more is said about the attitude of worship, the attitude of being together, the attitude of what it means to be a congregation and to be enjoying God as a community rather than as an individual. Our society has become more and more individualistic. We are, we don't like to join. We're not joiners. We're suspicious of the kind of control that people might have over us if we join something. We want to be free and we want to do it our way. The problem with that is that it is a very self-centered way of looking at things. We don't like our lives to be interfered with. And God is an interfering God. And church and worshiping together and the congregation is an interference into our lives. And that means that we're often very self-centered. We're brought up that way. That the only thing that really counts in our lives is us and our fulfillment. And we resent anything that stifles our freedom. When it comes to worship, even, we're full of different tastes. We like different kinds of music. We like different styles of church. And when we don't get what we want, we complain or we do some politics or something so that it can be meeting our needs. And the church has always struggled with that as an attitude. But now, in a day and age where consumerism rules, churches are viewed kind of in the same way. The point of church is to, in some respects, lay aside the self because of love. The attitude that we're supposed to have, that the New Testament talks about, the loving one another, is supposed to be the motivation for coming to church. And for years, that was not the case. For years it was a right. You did these things, you would go in, you'd pray, you'd light a candle, you'd take communion, you didn't talk to anybody necessarily. You didn't need to. You didn't need to love people. It was nice if you did, and it was promoted. But your faith didn't hang on the relationships. Your faith hung on doing the religious duty. So anybody coming to any church that isn't doing it for the right reasons might as well not even show up. There's so much in the New Testament about this. The attitude with which we approach church is so important. And right now, when we can't meet, it buys into, for some people, the kind of distance from each other or from the church that a lot of people like, because going to church for them is just, it's a duty. It's something you do because you were brought up there or whatever. The Bible does not really condone that. So I'm going to read just some scripture, just so that you get the heart of the expectation of loving one another. There's lots more scripture than I'm going to read, but we're going to start in Hebrews 10, verses 22 and 25. And some of these are just going to be very familiar to you. Let us draw near to God with our sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. Every holy day in the Old Testament is centered around people getting together, because God can be worshipped and prayed to in a closet. We're told to pray on our own. But when it comes to worship, God is worshipped in community. And one of the reasons is that our community is one of the most praiseworthy gifts that God gives us. The friendships, the relationships, the upholding, and so on are truly deeply important. Even if you're getting by and you think you have a good relationship with God, but these Christians and the way they do things, or you've seen it all, you've done it all, and it's boring. It is still a gift to you, to everybody. And maybe one of the good things about being in isolation and not being able to meet is that, just like fasting, we start to really value the church more, and the people, the relationships, and the worship that we do together. You can not make people worship God with all their hearts, but you can make an environment where that is encouraged, and that's what we try to do. John 13:34 and 35. I'm just going to read through some of these passages here. A new commandment I give to you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. It is a commandment. Romans 12 and verse 10. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. In our culture, that's just a terrifically difficult thing to do, to place other people above ourselves. Romans 13:8 and 10. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law, the commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Sometimes churches get all wrapped up in doing religion and doing good things and making people feel guilty if they don't. Our motivation is supposed to be love. We're supposed to be concerned. And it makes doing things for other people a privilege. If we lose sight of that, then it just becomes religion and it's useless. 2 Corinthians 13:11. Brothers and sisters, rejoice. Strive for full restoration. Encourage one another. Be of one mind. Live in peace. And the God of love and peace will be with you. Now, this passage is interesting because everybody wants to be with God, the God of love, the God of peace. They want that. They want that relationship. But in this passage, it looks as if That depends on the relationship that we have. We're supposed to be restored to each other. We're supposed to encourage one another. We're supposed to be in agreement with another. We're supposed to be at peace with one another. And if we get all those ducks lined up in a row, then God supernaturally gives us the things that we need to keep it going. But it is a discipline. 1 John 4:12. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. What this passage is getting at, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that there's nobody in our community sees God and goes, oh, there's God, I can see him and I will follow him. What they see is us. A lot of people will never experience God apart from our loving them, and that's a huge weight on us. People look at the church and they see backbiting and they see gossip and they see power struggles and people who push their way to the front, people who are demanding, people who are rude, people who aren't genuine. I grew up hearing this complaint from all my non-Christian friends that the church is just full of hypocrites. And yeah, there are people who are not very genuine in their faith. That's not the way it's supposed to be, and it's specifically not the way we are supposed to be. We are supposed to be fragrant. When people see us, they should see something that's beautiful that they would love to be a part of. There's so many passages that talk about the same thing. Right now, we cannot meet, but we can still love one another. We can still encourage each other. We can still take responsibility for each other and look out for each other. And when the sweet day comes, when we can meet, when this blows over and becomes handleable, we will meet again. And I look forward to that. I love the church. I love you guys, and I miss just being around people and talking to them and having coffee and so on. I miss that. So may God be close to you during this time. May he be giving you peace and encouragement, and may he be able to make use of this time when things are possibly a bit slower for you to focus on him. God bless.